thank you for joining me. Here we are. We have Professor Anita Varma from University of Texas in Austin, and she is a journalism professor. Okay, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I think we met virtually during COVID.
Yeah.
When Storybook was a part of a Pittsburgh Media Partnership. And in that session, the COVID meeting, not COVID meeting, but it was in that the PMP meeting, we talk about solidarity journalism.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to get back to that, right?
Excellent.
But just like in
Can't wait.
just like in all my other sessions, I'm always intrigued about the life's journey.
Yeah.
What makes you who you are and what you are right now.
Yeah.
I think we are both Asians,
Yes.
right?
Correct.
And from my perspective, not my perspective, but from my experience, my friends, how I grew up, my family, whatever, the parents, Asian parents, always like, you have to be an engineer, you have to be a doctor, you have to be a investment bankers, you have to be all these professionals.
Yeah.
But then, nobody's saying, no, I'll be proud of you if you're a journalist, right?
Yeah.
I'll be proud of you if you paint a mural, on the side of a building, like as an artist. I would be happy if you could blah, blah, blah. Right? Something that those are not that I have mentioned.
Yeah.
So what's your experience?
Yeah.
How did you become a journalism professor, which is, way out there?
Yeah, it is very, very different than many people in my family. I won't say all of them. I think that some of those tendencies to limit our paths are changing. But my parents are both physicians, and my brother and sister are also physicians. And my grandfather, right? This is not surprising. My grandfather was a physician, but he is actually also largely responsible for how I got into journalism. So when I was a kid, he actually moved to Pittsburgh from India. He had never left India before, but when my brother was born, that was his first grandchild, and he took early retirement and came here as soon as he could to be with his grandchild and then with the rest of us when we were born. And the main thing I remember about him is that anytime he was in the US, he was always based in Pittsburgh, he would be reading newspapers. He read every single newspaper. Unfortunately, some of them don't exist anymore, but I'm talking community newspapers, citywide newspapers, national newspapers. He would get India Abroad and India Today, and it would just be sometimes the bulk of his day as a retired person living in a country that he had never visited before. This is all 1980s, so there was no internet to speak of.
Right.
And by the evening, the one event is that we would all gather around and watch the evening news with him. And so I think that journalism was so crucial in his day-to-day life. And it's not because I hear a lot of people talk about journalism in terms of how it helps voters. But keeping in mind, my grandfather never voted in this country, right? That's not why he was reading it. But I think that people forget, and Storybook just does a great job of being a reminder of this, that so much of journalism is about culture. It's about how people understand the world, how they come together, how they may not come together. But I think for him, my sense is that journalism, especially local journalism, gave him some insight into a place where he, I don't think, expected to be helping to raise grandchildren in this very different environment. But I just have such a clear memory every time I come to Pittsburgh of all these newspapers everywhere in our house. And they were like prized items that would come in every single day. But I think that seeing that importance and seeing how relevant it was for my grandfather to understand Pittsburgh, to understand the US, and to help guide us as kids, it really has always made me an idealist about journalism. When I hear people talk about that, the media is the problem, the media is causing problems, I always get very defensive because I can see the problems, but I've also often noticed that there's a smaller percentage of any type of news media that are doing amazing work. And I consistently find that amazing work is aligned with not an ethic of exposure or transparency or even accountability, but it's actually an ethic of solidarity. And that is how I got into journalism, was watching my grandfather consume journalism and how devoted he was to it. And then in sixth grade, I had a Pittsburgh-based teacher who was a former journalist, and he taught us who, what, when, where, why, and how.
Right.
And I was hooked. I remember he put 3 facts on the chalkboard and said, everybody write a story based on these 3 facts. But then all of our stories were different. And it was that moment that I felt like there's something to this, right? It's not a science test where there's a right answer and a wrong answer. It's also not fictional. It wasn't made up entirely, but the way that we saw those facts and pieced them together was so distinctive. So I think those were some of the formative ways I ended up in journalism. I had the experience, let's call it, of graduating from college in 2008. And at that time, I always tell my students this, I did not have a good understanding of what was happening to the economy because the full crash happened a few months later, but I had applied for a bunch of jobs in print journalism. And instead of getting rejection letters, at that time, it still wasn't that common to get emails about jobs. So instead of getting rejection letters, I was getting these letters that said, we regret to inform you that we have ceased newsroom operations. And as a 22-year-old, I didn't really know what that meant. I thought that's strange and kind of bad luck on my part, but how odd that so many of them have ceased newsroom operations. And a few months later, when the crash happened, it became clear, journalism was already being affected by what affected the whole country shortly after, but those declining revenues leading to newsrooms shutting down altogether meant that my print journalism career ended before it began. So I ended up going into journalism schools and did my master's and PhD with a focus within communication on journalism and journalism ethics. But I have such high regard for journalists because I think they have the hardest jobs. They often receive the least amount of training compared to any other profession. And the stakes of what they're doing are actually enshrined in the First Amendment. So that makes them, people who have an incredible public responsibility and a terrible lack of support. So that's what I've hoped that my work can contribute, is to providing some of that support and also recognition that journalists are going through a lot. They're not here trying to ruin society from the majority of journalists I've talked to.
Right. So yeah, I agree, completely agree with you. But unfortunately, that those bigger newsrooms, the ones that get all this shares and clicks, that tend to be, what is it called? Sensation-based news.
Yeah.
That sometimes that I have to be on the news first before somebody else.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when they do that, they make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, even though they have published thousands of other good news, people will just zero in on the mistake. Like, this guy is blah, 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 right? This newspaper, right? But then at the same time, the way the market, I have to use the M word, right? The market sees it as it's a market, it's a free market. And then if the readers are engaged in a particular news, then that's that kind of newsroom that will succeed, right? And that's unfortunate. And you mentioned that those that are thriving and probably that are based on transparency, full of ethics, sometimes that they are not as popular, right, with the public, right? And that's where the hardship of running the operation is really, it's really high up there. It's really tough to run it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, since you went through all this J school, right? So do you think J school is required for people to be good journalists?
No, I think what's required is practice. And the journalists who I've encountered in J schools are amazing, tremendous, enormously talented, and I appreciate every single journalist I've met in J school. But I think where I see them flourish is when their feet are getting wet, right? And some J schools do a really fantastic job of setting things up, basically like a newsroom training ground. So at University of Austin, Texas, we have what's called Reporting Texas, and that's its own kind of mini digital news site. And other news organizations can pick up stories, so students will get syndicated effectively, which is great for their exposure. And I think it's a really practical way for. It's very hard to teach journalism as an abstract phenomenon. You learn it by doing. But I do find that more and more there's recognition. Particularly, I know Columbia has been doing some work around this, and UC Berkeley, where I was also teaching journalism ethics in the pandemic. Around the issue of affordability. Many journalists are never, ever going to be able to afford J school. And frankly, even if they can afford it, there's a question mark around whether journalism, to your point about the challenges of a journalism market, will they ever earn enough to pay back the loans they may need to take out? And so I think that those questions, I really appreciate J schools that are trying to grapple with those questions. But I don't see much evidence that you must go through a J school, right? We would be very concerned about a physician who never went to medical school. But I think that journalists, increasingly, there's a culture of trying to get the training through other means. So I know Pointer does some great training, and some of the night centers to make that available. The downside, though, is that journalists struggle. And whether you go through J school or don't go through J school, I think largely journalists report now that they're struggling more than the folks who came up a generation before. And so I think the question is, whether it comes from J schools or through nonprofits or through public means, what will it look like to support journalists and support journalism? I'm not convinced that J school is the number one answer to supporting journalists. It's also often a short term. Some programs are only 9 months long. And that can be good for having some space to understand the fundamentals and some of the best practices. But I think most journalists who I've seen are ones who have done it and then they do it again and they do it again and it gets better each time. So that would be my main response. I think the benefit, though, of J school that journalists have told me, I find it fascinating when someone will be a journalist and then they'll go to J school after they've been a journalist. I'm always wondering, why would you do that if you're already a journalist? But their answer is that J school gave them some space to reflect on what they were doing and not just run through the next story, which I see as beneficial. I think reflective practice is really important. And unfortunately now, many students in J schools are also having to work full-time jobs to pay for those tuition bills. And so I think that reflective space is sometimes limited. But I also really adore J schools for how much they can see the positive impact of journalism. And I think when journalists face a lot of hostility from the public, it can help if they've gotten kind of that affirmation or they have a sense of community outside of maybe people who are not too pleased with a journalist.
Yeah. I like that when you mentioned that, it's a space to do some reflective practice even after they already got a job, secure a job as a journalist. I think, it's because otherwise, you're on the daily run, right? You produce this, print this, submit this to your editor. So sometimes you forget, probably there are newer methods, probably there are newer understanding, or probably for the person itself, how can, are you happy with the job, or are you happy with the way you do interview, for example, right? That's pretty much reflective. It sounds like a great retreat program.
Exactly.
It's like even like for companies, sometimes they do that, right? Like, okay, let's have a retreat, 3-day powwow, right? And then when people just think about problems, how they do business, and then they come up with okay, this is what we're gonna do for the next 18 months or a year or whatever, right? So that's I can completely see that. But at the same time, like you mentioned, I think just it's applicable to almost all schools, right? High, more, for the higher educations, that people are like wondering, do you need to pay, this, I don't know, what is the tuition now? CMU, like, I don't know, 50, 60K per year,
Mhm.
right? Times four.
Yeah.
And then what kind of salary do you need to have after you graduate to pay back that,
Yeah.
huge loan, right? So that's quite challenging, right? Especially for those who are not that motivated,
Yeah.
or do not really know what they want to do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that could be challenging. I mean, right now I'm thinking, because I'm a parent and
Yeah.
my youngest one is a junior in high school,
Oh.
and she's still thinking about what she wants to do.
Yeah.
But the oldest one, he graduated college already and is working full time.
Mhm.
But yeah, so these are the questions that, like, okay,
Yeah.
so it's like, this is the passion, but this passion doesn't pay. So what you're gonna do?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Honestly, I think I teach undergrads, master students, and PhD students, and I often find that undergrads at any institution, they seem to be finding themselves more than they're finding their major. And so they'll do the major and some of them do quite well academically. But I think the benefit of college that often doesn't get talked about is that it's a chance for people who are, 18, 19, 20 to come into their own. And I had a fantastic undergraduate experience at Vassar College. I studied media studies. I tell you right now, I do not remember any of the specific syllabus, right? And that's not what any of us remember from college. What we remember is how we struggled and finally figured out how to write a successful, coherent essay. And I think that skill can serve people for a very long time, right?
Right.
Across different fields, even if it's not a specific job in that major. And similar for engineers, I know I've heard from a lot of friends who graduated 15 years ago that engineering has changed so much, but the skill set of how to approach a problem stays pretty consistent.
Yeah,
Things may adapt.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
often more important for undergrads than it is to see that they chose the perfect major. Perfect major probably doesn't exist.
Right, right. Like you mentioned, like, it hasn't changed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Newton's law is still the same for the past how many hundreds of years?
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, so going back to the family. So when you decided you wanted to be in journalism, so what did your family respond?
What did they respond?
Probably your granddad said, "Oh, that's great," but what about the rest?
They were a little confused. So the first question I always get, even today it happened, not from my family, but connected to the family, is, does that mean you're going to be on TV? So that's the first question. But I adore my family so much. I think that they are still a little bit bewildered. And it's not any sort of negative judgment of journalism. As I mentioned, we've subscribed to more news than most of the country. But I think it's just not a path that they saw or had any past experience with. So their first reaction was, okay, I think what she's saying is she doesn't want to be a medical doctor. And so the answer was, well, then how about you try law school?
Oh, yes, that's another one.
And so law school was supposed to be the answer. And initially I thought, no, I can make this work. But in 2008, when all of those print journalism outlets that I had been admiring and aiming for and hoping to come up in ceased to exist, I started wondering maybe law school is a better answer. And my family rejoiced. They were like, yes, she is going to go to law school. I had a stack of LSAT books this tall. And it just was never a fit. I would open these LSAT books, and I have every amount of respect for folks who do the LSAT and go to law school, but I could not connect with it. And I kept feeling this draw back to journalism. But I think that ultimately my family, of course, families want us to be happy. But during my PhDs are struggles for everybody. Any PhD who tells you it's not is mistaken. They've just forgotten what a struggle it was. But when my PhD was really quite difficult, I remember my family, with every good intention, they said, it's not too late to go to medical school. So
default.
Right. So they really like, I forget his name now. He's the person on CNN, or he was on CNN. He's an MD and a journalist. I'll remember his name later, but
yeah, that he was almost the Surgeon General, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I forgot. I watch, Yeah, I consume his article or his
Yes.
video a lot.
Yeah.
Sanjay Gupta.
Sanjay Gupta, thank you. So my parents also, would just suggest that I consider the fact that he is both an MD and a journalist. So wouldn't that be nice? But I think oftentimes, and I hear this from parents of students who I teach in journalism now, they're very concerned about what the professional outlook will be. I mean, we
Yes.
hear every day, including right now in December 2023, how many layoffs are happening. And most journalists will go through not just one layoff, they'll go through regular layoffs through no fault of their own. It's not a
Yeah.
reflection of their quality or of their importance. But as you were mentioning, the market is just so inhospitable. And I think for folks who came to the US more recently, my parents came to the US in the 70s, that's quite frightening. The idea of not having a stable career path, or at least not having, no career path is completely stable, but having some high expectation
Right.
of stability.
Right.
But I consider myself fortunate to have grown up in Pittsburgh where I could see people doing so many different things and making it work. So I think that helped me develop a sense that it will be hard, but that it would also be possible.
And you were born in Pittsburgh.
Yes,
right?
McGee Women's Hospital.
Oh, so which neighborhood did you live?
So when I was born, we were living in Bethel Park. So my parents, when they came to the U.S., they were in Michigan, and then the only place they both got jobs after their medical training was Pittsburgh. So they lived in Oakland. My brother learned to walk in Shenley Park. My grandfather would take him there and practice. And then by the time my sister and I were born, they had moved to Bethel Park. And then when we were in school, we moved to Upper St. Clair.
Because of the very good school district, probably?
Probably. Yes. Very likely.
Yes. So that's a story we had when we moved, and my family and I moved here in 2010.
Yeah.
So my wife got a job at Pitt. So her faculty colleagues like, I live in Mount Lebanon, that area, Upper St. Clair. The school is really great, and there's a lot of faculty live there. So we tried.
Yeah.
We went to Liberty Bridge.
Nice.
And we were stuck there.
We were stuck there. That is what happens on the Liberty Bridge. That's true.
And my wife said, doing this every day? U-turn.
Oh, wow. So where did you all move?
So we live, walking distance from Pitt in the Squirrel Hill.
Yeah,
So
I love Squirrel Hill.
So my kids, so they went through the public school, Colfax, all their lives. So because of that, I remember that, we were on Liberty Bridge.
Yes.
Like, okay, make a U-turn. Okay, you could not make a U-turn right there, right? So you had to drive through Dormont, one of those car dealership, and made U-turn.
So I went to Falk School in Oakland.
Oh, yeah.
And so that commute.
My daughter went
Falk
School too, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So going from the South Hills to Falk School every day, it was the Liberty Bridge.
Yeah.
On and on. It was just, that's how I learned to be a patient person, because that's all you can do.
Yeah. But I bet that you have to go early, and especially your parents, right? Are physicians, and they start their day early.
That's so cool that your daughter went to Falk School.
Yeah. She went, for my son, he went all the way to high school and public system. And my daughter, I think she went to Colfax for a few years and then transferred to Falk. And then COVID happened, so I just like, okay, I have to homeschool, And right now she goes to Shady Side somewhere.
Nice.
Private school in Shady Side, not Shady Side Academy, somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that's a good story sometimes for Pittsburghers. Just like, we share. It's only like people said like what three connections.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Like a 6 degree of cake and bacon. Now in Pittsburgh, we have like 3 degrees.
I love that though. Usually when I say Falk School, people are like, "What's that?" But I'm so excited. Yeah. I went there kindergarten through 8th grade.
Oh wow, the entire thing.
Yeah, the whole thing. So it was a lot of time on the Liberty Bridge going in and on the Fort Pitt Bridge coming back.
So about the going back to about the media is a problem, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that people always Not always. Some of them, a
Yeah.
lot of them, like it doesn't matter who you believe or vote for,
Yeah.
but it's like by default, oh yeah, media is blah blah blah. Like,
Yeah.
why?
Why? So I think number one, there's a visibility aspect. The media, as you know, the people that constitute it are the most publicly visible of any profession that we might think of in the US, right? And I know Instagram and social media make other types of people visible as well. But in terms of not an individual with an account, but an actual institution of, you know, companies and people being uh, employed directly, I think the media are the longest standing and most publicly visible institution. In spaces like medicine or law, there's always an aspect where not everything is made public. And that's by design, right? We wouldn't want our physicians or healthcare workers to make everything public. But I think there's still some layer of, I wouldn't call it secrecy, but there's some aspect that the public doesn't see. But with the media, they believe that they're seeing everything that's going on. And I think that to the extent that, well, I think journalism has done a good job oftentimes of taking credit for helping when things are bad, but that also brings with it the opposite side of that coin, which is that then journalism may get blamed when things are bad. And what I often try to remind people who are, when I say I teach journalism ethics, they often say, "What's that?" And I try to
Is
remind
there
them,
any?
right? Do those still exist? We could use some. I've heard it all. But I try to remind them that, you know, at the end of the day, journalists are people, and they're people who actually don't receive a lot of training about how to do good work. And so they're figuring it out as they go. And I think there's not a large amount of understanding of how difficult journalism is to do. So the assumption is, well, the media should be giving me this neat and clear picture of the world because I had to go to work all day. So now I need the media to tell me what I missed. And it should be accurate. It should be comprehensively sourced. It should be clear. It should be easy to follow. It should also be entertaining. And it should be aligned with what I think happened today. Now, chances are high that the media rarely do all of those things, but it's not really because the media are singular or singularly out to destroy society. I think that for the most part, people also have, in psychology, we call it a negativity bias. So we're all kind of hardwired to pay more attention to negative things, and that's how we survive. So if we only pay attention to the good, you could get, you know, run over or eaten by a lion out in the wild. But if you pay attention to the negative, then you're more likely to survive. So I think that's also why people tend to focus on the worst of what news media have done. And in my work, I try to look at the best. So I never ignore or deny the harms that media have caused and continue to cause. But I also think it is inaccurate to paint everyone with the same brush, right? And also to try to emphasize when it has gone well, what is it exactly that's going well? Sometimes audiences that criticize the media have a very difficult time explaining what it is that would satisfy them, because it's almost as if it came from the media, then it must be bad. It must be just out for clickbait or must be out to try to give us nightmares. But what would be better is often a question that people can't quite answer. But yeah, I think the short version of this answer is that media tend to be the scapegoat. And in some ways, I think media set themselves up to be that because they like to insist that they are very relevant and they are impacting society. Right? But when that impact is not looking good, there's some trouble there. But yeah, I do think it's visibility, it's like an availability heuristic. The thing that we see as most salient to us is the thing we'll blame for a lot of problems. And the truth of the matter being that many news organizations will publish inaccurate reports, and there's often not a good mechanism for correcting those. And so people end up quite frustrated. The backstory of that, though, is that no story is perfect, right? And so I think as soon as people try their own hand at journalism, they see how difficult it is to do a story that is 100% beyond any sort of ambiguity, perfectly, aligned with how things happened and with how everyone believes it happened, right? These things create a lot of space for inaccuracy, maybe, but also distortion or accusations of distortion. And yeah, I think these things stack the deck against the media.
Yeah. So there are many media newsrooms out there, and I can, even like a one-person newsroom, it's still a media, right? And on the flip side of it, when you say people, there are a lot of people, right? And everyone has their own beliefs that that unfortunately only the loud ones are heard, right? And probably the loud ones do not represent, the entire people. Even when I said it, I'm like, it's absurd when you say it. Like it's like one person represents whatever organization. Let it be the lefties, let it be the righties, right? Like one person is just that one represent everybody. No, that's absurd. It can't be. You have to honor the differences within that group, right? But then, like you said, that if the media is going to publish something that covers everything, there's probably is going to be I don't know, 10 pages or probably even more, 1,000 pages of news that's not news anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So we see the impossibility of perfection, right? And so I think that's what I really encourage journalists to consider, that ultimately journalism is a set of judgments. And judgments are not true or false. Judgments are right or wrong.
Right.
And so I think that's where journalism has often been misunderstood as, we can say with a lot of certainty that there is a water bottle on this table. I don't think that requires any sort of judgment other than, perceiving. But journalism is not about what's on the table, right? Journalism is about much more complicated things than that. And I don't think it helps to say, well, let's have journalists stop doing what they're doing and we'll just leave it to loud individuals to tell us their version of events.
Yeah.
But I think that's absolutely what makes it hard, because to be journalism, it can't be a 10-page or 1,000-page report. And it also inevitably requires making some decisions. Who gets to be heard? Who doesn't get to be heard? And under what conditions do they come into the story?
Right. And again, unfortunately, as a business, right, that they will do focus group or whatever. Then who are their audience, right? Who are their audience, and what do they like to read and continue reading, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's why, people say, okay, this CNN, I forgot who made it, but there's a chart, right? Where they are on the spectrum of, left and right, and what their positions, right? Who are in the middle. That even that chart is almost changing every 2-3 years, probably every 4 years. They're kind of shifting. I know that there are some outliers that are extremes, but it's interesting. Like for me personally, when I read news, I like to read news from many sources. Because that's how because I cannot hope for one newsroom to be consistently this. Sometimes, of course, they are biased, right? So, but when you read multiple sources, just like your grandfather, you read all perspectives. Just like when you mentioned the exercise that you had when you were in sixth grader, that's amazing. Honestly, I had that realization only, I don't know, probably less than 10 years ago. That I had, this is a cup, right? But from which angle are you looking at it, right?
Exactly.
Right? Some would say this is a pitch black. Some would say, no, it's not black. Probably it's like a whatever, right?
Yeah.
And that, because I think I studied and I grew up in all this engineering mindset, and like F equal AM, and that's it.
Right.
That's the definition of force, by the way, by Newton. But, right, and that never changed, and it's a very exact, right? But but when you're talking about humanity,
I think that's the key term, change, and that's what makes journalism so difficult. I mean, I used to give the example that the weather reporter had an easy job, and now even that's not true, right? So I think that due to changing conditions, and that's what news is ultimately, if it's not new, chances are you're not going to, have some breaking news that tables exist. Like that's not news anymore. But due to those changing conditions, journalists are going through those changes as society goes through them. And because journalists in the US are not very well trained at the outset. They are thrown in the deep end of the pool and told to figure it out. And by the way, all that's at stake is democracy. I mean, that's a lot of pressure. And so I think that's where, as the reading public or the viewing or listening public, we also have an obligation to not just criticize media, but to offer actionable ways that it can be better, and within the confines of, what is feasible when there are these market pressures, what is feasible when journalists' salaries are dropping below living wages. In Austin, there were a bunch of local reporters who were protesting because they can't afford to live in Austin when they're expected to cover Austin, right?
Right.
And so in those conditions, to say, well, this journalist should have covered this incident in the community differently, if they were driving 2 hours to get to the community, that might be a different reason that we wouldn't necessarily blame them for how that story could have been better, but also to try to think creatively about how those problems can be addressed, so that journalism can do the public service that it's designed to do.
Yeah. So not all journalists like Christine Amanpour or Anderson, right? Anderson Cooper. Yeah, they traveled on expense. Not typical journalists.
Exactly.
So, okay. So now, with the challenges of have all this comprehensive, unbiased perspective, or all perspectives in an article or in a news story. So why solidarity journalism? Because this is something that I must say that probably you invented. You coined the term, right? So this solidarity, because on the outset of it, it's like, solidarity, does it mean that you are leaning towards a particular perspective? Because that's what it sounds like, right? That's why probably, I don't know, I'm just probably speculating. Probably some people may say that all this old school journalists may say, saying, that's not journalism. You're like, it's more like activism than journalism. Journalism is blah, 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 right? So what's, before you explain about that, so let me take the audience, also the viewers, this website, the audience right now, if you have a screen, you can see it here. It's a mediaengagement.org. If you're only listening, just Google it or just go to mediaengagement.org. It has anything about solidarity, just journalism. So,
it is also available in Spanish. You'll see that link on the site too.
All right.
Very happy to have worked with an excellent translator who is credited on those pages. And we're so pleased with how UT Austin has supported this work, as well as Democracy Fund, who's been with us from the very beginning. And I always try to mention that this all began at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics, which is where I was.
In Santa Clara University, right?
Santa Clara University, yeah. So solidarity journalism, I did popularize the term. I think others have used it. And the practice of it actually dates back to 1827. 1827, with the Freedom Journal, in which they memorably wrote, "We wish to plead our own cause." And this was the first Black newspaper, and I think the founding document that was published for that newspaper is still so applicable around the problems and the reasons that Black journalists started their own newspaper instead of going with the quote-unquote objective press, who Ida B. Wells has called the lying press. And the dehumanization of Black people in this country, I think, is the original sin of journalism, and one that dominant journalism has never made right. And that's really the origins of solidarity journalism, as people notice that their communities, their lives, their struggles are being represented as though they are to blame for their own problems, when in fact the structures are what is causing these issues, not personal shortcomings. And I think tracing that from 1827, we can go into the 1800s with the muckraker journalists, who were consistently concerned about vulnerable groups, concerned about child laborers, concerned about people living in tenements, concerned about factory working conditions, concerned about the length of the workday. And then we get into 1900s and 2000s, and consistently we see journalism awards that are awarded precisely for journalism doing activism, right? So I've looked tirelessly, and I've yet to find a journalism award that gets awarded for remaining objective, neutral, detached, impartial. On the contrary, all of these journalism awards coming from within journalism, I'm not giving anyone an award. I would love to, but that's not my job. All of these awards coming from within journalism, including the Pulitzer Prizes, they honor journalism for making a difference in society. And I think as soon as we're honoring journalism for making a difference in society, that's activism right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Now you mentioned that, all these pictures, all these titles, all these articles, names that just pop up in my head, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's
So
what happens.
Is that
We
kind of
can't
like
unsee it.
why you're teaching it to be unbiased, but at the same time you're awarding, so it's like all this, the carrots are on the others. I mean,
exactly. And I think that word unbiased is also so fascinating because across centuries of US journalism, the bias is actually, it tends not to be in the interest of a political party or in the interest of a particular individual set of interests, but instead the bias that gets awarded and gets recognized, celebrated, put in journalism schools is a bias towards people's basic dignity. So to say that, if a group of people's basic dignity, their basic humanity is at stake, then journalism needs to report that. There's nothing unbiased about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dignity is a value. And I think it's one of the most important ethical values that exists, not just in the US, but anywhere, since without basic human dignity, I think we've lost the plot, right? If we can't uphold that in a society, then we really have some work to do. And that's the work that I think ethical journalism has been calling on society to be doing for a long time. The problem is that many journalists are never told that A, basic dignity is what brings together a lot of what they're aiming to do, and B, that it's not a bad thing to be biased in favor of basic human dignity. I think there's lots of reasons to argue that there's a problem with partisan bias or that there's a problem with anti-fill-in-the-blank bias. But I've never heard a compelling argument against a bias towards people's basic humanity. And so the idea of solidarity, usually people hear that and they think, oh, solidarity like after 9/11, where we're going to wave flags. Or they hear solidarity and they think, probably that means like workers standing together, like in strikes and labor unions. Or they hear solidarity and they think of party politics. And that's not really the sense of solidarity that I find as most relevant to journalism. I think those all exist, but the most relevant and valuable form of solidarity is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. When social justice means, according to Immanuel Kant, means dignity for everyone in a society. That's all social justice is. And I think this term social justice has become so fraught that many people in journalism hear the word social justice and they think it's a bad word until award season. And at that point, I've looked at these letters, right? Editors who are hardcore into quote unquote objectivity, suddenly that all goes out the window and they want to talk about how their journalism advanced justice. And I think that's great. I think journalism should advance justice. But I also think that journalism does itself a disservice by, except for award season, pretending that that's not what they're doing, pretending that it's a view from nowhere. So that's some of where this concept and focus on solidarity comes from. I often find it surprising, but journalists tend to be very, very keen on this term. Journalists coming up right now, I've yet to meet one who says, I'm here for objectivity. At the end of my career, I want to have advanced journalistic objectivity as it's been practiced and as it's dehumanized communities for centuries. None of them say that. That's not what they're here to do. They get into journalism and struggle to pay their rent or to live anywhere near the communities they cover because, as they've told me, they're trying to change the world. I think that's an amazing form of activism. But I fail to understand why someone would make all those sacrifices to try to change the world and then pretend that's not what they're doing, right?
Right, right.
So,
Yeah. So what's the problem with admitting that, right?
yeah.
And yeah, so have you ever figured out why?
I think that this term solidarity is one that is poorly understood in a US context, actually.
Mm,
I only came to that term in graduate school. I had vaguely heard it at some point in the context of worker strikes, but I didn't really have much of an understanding of it. And so it wasn't even a vocabulary word in terms of how we talk about things. And I think that is changing now. But for many people, it's kind of a foreign concept and one that sounds like it's not very scientific. And the answer is journalism is not very scientific. But journalism has often in the US been trying to claim a kind of scientific certainty about the world, to claim a mantle of authority that we know what's going on. So you need to trust us as journalists because we know better than someone who's not a journalist. But in solidarity, that suggests that journalists are not, and journalism is not somehow standing above society, looking down on it, but instead that journalism stands with society. And that gets more complicated as it also raises the question of solidarity with who? Solidarity with
right,
what?
right.
And I think those are questions that oftentimes in journalism, we see it sort of implicit. It's not an explicit commitment. And so that's been part of what I hope the Solidarity Journalism Initiative provides, which is a way for journalists to talk about what they're doing in order to explain why they're doing things the way they're doing them and to defend it. I think journalists have to defend their craft more than ever before due to social media tendencies.
Hmm.
And, defending your work is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think you need the tools for that job. So that's what Solidarity can provide.
Right. So yeah. So it's kind of yeah odd to me, weird to me
Yeah.
that that's all we do. We all work, in this space, like for the basic human dignity, and
Yeah.
then and it's really raw. I mean,
Mhm.
it's really what we are here.
Yeah.
I mean, even as a human, or sometimes, probably we work for human dignity of ourselves, right,
Mhm.
from our family, and then go to the community, and then it gets bigger and bigger. But the problem is that the way to get there is
Yeah.
different, right? I
Yeah.
mean, maybe different. Again, going back to that, when we say about people, when we say about everyone, that we are
Yeah.
talking about billions of people, and then they may have a different way,
Yeah.
right? Like even like a drinking a cup of water. There are so many ways to do it. Some people just use
Yeah.
tap water. Some people would boil the water for
Yeah.
10 minutes. Some people would go to whatever and then get the Fiji water, right? So so there's so many ways to get there,
Yeah.
and that's where things get problematic,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because like my way is better, your way will, I don't know, whatever, enrich, or this one will only do blah blah blah, right? So yeah, that is the common thread with
I think that's such a fantastic example you gave too of the water, because what solidarity journalism gets concerned about is when you named a bunch of ways that people may drink water, prepare water, but what about the people who don't have clean drinking water? This happened just this past spring due to Cyclone Freddy, which hit several countries in Africa particularly hard. It was the longest lasting and the most energy in a cyclone recorded in history.
wow.
And thousands upon thousands of people did not have clean water because when cyclones hit like that and that amount of flooding happens, there's sewage in the water supply. And what I find surprising is that despite a lot of commitments to doing more climate coverage, Cyclone Freddy was covered in a very limited way compared to other hurricanes, which are not actually as destructive. I'm not saying we should,
Mhm.
compete with each other, but we would expect something at that scale to be big news. Precisely not because weather events are fascinating on their own, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but because of that impact on whether people had water to drink. How does a person get through their day or even half a day without clean water? The answer is likely that they can't, right? Dehydration will lead to your whole system shutting down after not too long. And so I think that that's where solidarity journalism starts to spring into action to say, yes, we have a bunch of different ways that people consume water, but the folks that we need to focus on are the ones who don't get to be part of that array because they don't have it to consume. So what is the structural answer? What are the reasons? What are the needs that that the wider public needs to know about?
Right. And then, honestly, when you mentioned about Cyclone Freddy, I tried to find in my head like Cyclone Freddy.
Right.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
I know we heard all this alphabets, coming from the Gulf, right? But it's unfortunate.
Yeah. I also, as someone who reads a lot of journalism, maybe not as much as my grandfather did, but a lot every single day, I also had not heard about it until I was preparing a class on climate change reporting. And I was looking for a recent example. And because I went looking for it, that's where I started to see some coverage that did happen. But it wasn't in any way, one of the things that we expect to see in the 2023 roundups of major media events this year, which is astonishing given how, first of all, for the people directly impacted, and second of all, it signals, from what I've read about it, that the ocean has become hot enough to conduct that amount of heat and energy that this is likely not going to be the isolated incident of a very strong and long-lasting cyclone. The longer cyclones last, the more destruction they do. And I think that it raises a lot of questions about under what circumstances, right? I heard in one of the earlier podcast episodes that you're from Indonesia, and largely, there's a little bit of mention of Jakarta and the sea level rising,
Right.
but very little. But that has such important implications globally that we might start to question why we're not hearing more about these issues where people's basic dignity, their basic survival. I don't mean can they go to college for free? We can fight about that another time, but can they survive
Right.
is what's at stake.
Yes. And so all these topics, all these things that we have to cover as, we means, this journalist, I still sometimes call myself, I don't call myself journalist, but, like these people, the news content, whatever, right? Trying to make these articles for stories for people to hear. And, it's hard for one person, one newsroom to do it, right? So we have to collaborate, even for basic costs, right? Operating costs, overhead costs. Right now, here, Storyburg, we are on the 10th floor of Benedum Trees building downtown. I could see the market square, the skating ring, right? So we are privileged and grateful for this space funded by Benter Foundation, run by Point Park University Center Media of Innovation. But space itself is not enough. We have to work together, right? And so far, I haven't seen a good collaborative work anywhere, right? Probably once or twice, but it's not in a sustainable way. Probably I think several years ago, Resolve Philly, I think did it really well, right? But I'm not sure whether they're still at that level, whether that collaboration is still happening. Probably still happening, but then the work what they do, is it still, the tough one? Let's say, for example, we have example for this, even for these pictures, this is like a collective work of a lot of people. Some I took those pictures myself. Some like by other freelancers in Pittsburgh, right? But this is a collective work, and I think that's what journalism have to do as well. So while you are here, and I see that you have done extensive research and work. I saw your publication there, like. So I wonder.
More.
Of course, the work's never done. So what can you share, or about collaborations, which I believe that it's quite hand in hand with the solidarity, right? So to make it work.
So there are a few layers to collaboration when we think about collaboration in a solidarity sense. So one layer is, and I was very happy to talk at the Association of Alternative News Media this summer in Dallas about this. I think they did a great job bringing together a lot of alternative news outlets that are trying to do more in terms of collaboration, but I think one space for collaboration and solidarity is with the communities you're trying to cover. So I know Storyburg is so rooted in communities that it's not like a separation of here's the journalist and here's the community. It's one and the same. But most news outlets, you have the news outlets standing a little bit separately from the communities they're covering. And what I encouraged in Dallas, and I was really enjoying the conversation that followed, is for journalists to think of themselves as collaborating with their sources as opposed to extracting, getting the story and then marching away with it and, commodifying it. And there was some concern or question, which I think is a really important question but what about journalistic independence, right? Sources, communities who are being covered will have a set of interests, of course. And to that, I would say, well, in any state, we have state governments, and when state governments are engaging in any form of formal activity, journalists are very likely to cover what the state government says that their agenda is. How is that not collaboration with a set of sources, right? In that case, the state government is setting an agenda that journalists then take up, and they go ahead and cover the stories. Sometimes governors will even issue lists of their priorities for a year, and journalists will cover that. So in that scenario, whether journalists were completely cognizant of it or not, they were collaborating with the state government. It's just that in that scenario, which is very common across multiple states, the state government was calling the shots, right? And so I think to the extent that journalists have normalized that kind of dynamic, there's very little reason not to entertain the idea that similarly, a community's agenda, we don't have to deny that the agenda exists, but why is it that journalism would imagine rejecting that agenda when other agendas are treated as newsworthy? So I think treating it as collaboration also gets journalists away from this idea that they're giving, quote unquote, voice to the voiceless, right? Everybody already has a voice. The question is who gets amplified through journalism and through media. But in collaboration with sources, I think journalists have an opportunity to figure out what they don't know. And I think it's completely unfair that journalists are expected to know everything about everything. It's just not possible. We all have a realm of experience, but I think journalists have a chance to collaborate more, especially with community sources, to listen not just in the interest of getting their story filed on time, because that story that they file on time could have a lot of misunderstanding if they haven't taken the chance to listen. So I think at that level, there's collaboration between folks that are identifying as journalists and those that are more subjects of journalism. And then the type of collaboration that you mentioned between news outlets or between journalists, I agree, it is very hard to find a successful example. One of the earliest collaborations I studied was called the San Francisco Homeless Project. It happened in 2016, and it was more than 70 news outlets that all said, for today, June 29th, 2016, we will not compete with each other. We will all cover homelessness on the same day. And the reason for that could be interpreted as an act of solidarity to say we all need to stand together to call for action on homelessness. But when I interviewed editors and reporters and columnists involved, what they told me was that they didn't use this phrase exactly, but the main takeaway of those interviews is that it was a collaboration in name only. So at a top level, they did have this shared commitment, but specifically, they were all doing their own stories. And they actually had a shared Google document in which there would have been a chance to say, oh, this person's covering the story, let me work with them. But instead, what they did, which I find fascinating, is that they looked to make sure no one was writing the same story as them. So they were still within the auspices of collaboration. There was a layer of trying to differentiate themselves. And so I think that's very common, not because these particular journalists did something wrong or anything like that, but because journalism itself incentivizes, make your story different. Haven't we heard this story before? So make sure that you're adding something new. And it doesn't really incentivize organizations working together. The one way that I think that is shifting is that whether it's a nonprofit news outlet or a for-profit news outlet or a public news outlet, they don't have the financial resources to do everything alone
Mhm.
anymore. And so I think that is creating a very practical pressure for newsrooms to start to partner more often. I saw recently Texas Tribune and ProPublica partnered on more Uvalde investigations that I doubt either organization could have done that level of work alone. And I also imagine they would agree with that because this partnership has been really really brought forth a lot that was not being reported on Uvalde. And I think that in other cases, there's short-lived collaborations, but it also requires everyone to come to the table and to be willing to listen. But I think that my hope has still been that funders will start to encourage more collaboration by funding it. And I think that that is a great way to get people to a table. But if you're on a grant that in no way incentivizes collaboration, it's very unlikely that that collaboration will even have time in the day to happen.
Right. Even when the funders request or incentivize collaboration,
Mhm.
that I hope when that happens, they create rubrics
Yeah.
and specifying what collaboration means, right?
Yeah.
As you said, that sometimes yeah, it's just by name only.
Right.
Yes, because they share the same printer, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that doesn't cut it, right? So collaboration means what? So at least if they have a first level
Yeah.
objectives, right? For
Yeah.
example, okay, cover homelessness, and probably would be geographic. Yeah, this newsroom, I don't know, probably lottery. This person will get Tenderloin. This one will get
Yeah.
Mission District. This one will get all those district, or probably could be a segmentized you create a separate segment. Probably this is for elderly homelessness. This is for children. This is for I don't know. Like there's so many
Yeah.
ways, right? To cover it, right? Because it's a lot. It's many.
Yeah.
Just like pick a topic. Let it be climate change. Well, it's kind of big. Homelessness is quite big. Something local. For example,
Mhm.
just trash in downtown.
Yeah.
Not saying that they have a lot of trash these days, right? But it's just random, right? Even
Yeah.
that, there's so many aspects of it, right? Well, where does the trash
Yeah.
go? That's a story. Is it going to
Yeah.
be recycled? Is it going to go to incinerator or whatever, right? Incinerator,
Yeah.
or like where does it come from, right? Or what kind of trash do we get, right?
Yeah.
And then which locations? There's many aspects of it.
Yeah.
If the newsroom can talk and decide, I'm good at covering that. I'm good at covering
Absolutely.
that. I'm more like I'm not comfortable for like
Yeah.
relating to the considered bias. Like if you talk to the community directly,
Yeah.
you're going to be biased, right? There's some newsrooms who are comfortable with it, right?
Sure.
Like
Sure.
assign them, right? Okay, this newsroom
Yeah.
will talk. Will get embedded to this problem, to this
Yeah.
community, and they will speak with the community. And while the other newsrooms probably talk
Yeah.
about the scientific papers or whatever, or talk to the politicians about it, right? So
Right.
it's doable.
Absolutely. And it was actually this time last year that I was revising a paper that's been published since then, comparing different types of reporting, comparing solidarity reporting to official focused reporting. And in the same collaboration, San Francisco Homeless Project, disproportionately, all these news outlets, all 70 of them, they tended to focus on the same local officials. So you basically, as someone who read all 325 articles, it was like I was reading the same story multiple times, which is so
Wow.
strange when they're coming from different news outlets that were in some way trying to be different. And the funny part is that one of the smallest news outlets, I think it had less than 5 people working there at the time, they did what I would argue was the most accurate coverage because they didn't just repeat what the city supervisors claimed. They talked to the people living in tent encampments and heard from them that when a city supervisor says people just need to go to a shelter, that's actually not a very truthful sentence, given that at the time, shelters in San Francisco were completely full. So you can't go somewhere that is not going to let you in the door, right? There's no getting in. And that's not the fault of being, quote unquote, shelter resistant, but it's not a fact that officials were willing to admit. right? There are many facts that officials are not willing to admit. And that very small newsroom, I think, did phenomenal work simply by talking to people. When I interviewed that journalist, he was a little confused about why I was so interested in what he did. He said, I do what journalists do. I talk to people. And it would be great if that's what all journalists did. But it tends not to be. And I think that's also one reason that journalism struggles to find and retain and grow an audience because of the repetition. If Taylor Swift is dating someone new today, why is it that 200 news outlets are covering that? I mean, there's even more celebrities than Taylor Swift, but they're all covering the exact same story, quote. It's really repetitive, which means that none of those news outlets doing that are going to see their audience share go in the direction they want it to. So I think that's also where collaboration can bring in some of that reflective practice to take a minute and recognize, repeating the same thing over and over again is not even the way to market success, let alone to ethical success.
Yeah, so that's a challenge, right? I think the way I say that, why does 200 newsrooms are covering, Taylor Swift and
who I love, by the way. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Nothing against Taylor
Show me the
Swift.
bracelet. And I guess it's like they're trying to get a chunk of this market share, right? Everybody is, Taylor Swift just draws thousands, if not millions, right? If they wonder, if they Google it, all right, I don't know. Yeah. Well, I don't know where she was last weekend, but right,
we
and
could
people
find
would just
out easily.
Google it, and then all this newsroom is trying to compete to be number one on Google.
Yeah.
Right. So the fastest, the more audience, and they get engagement or they get clicks, right, and they're happy, and they get all these ads, right? So so if when we do all this news about the basic human dignity, and that's the challenge. We have to collaborate because we can't compete with Taylor. Nobody can.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a lot of work, and collaborations, and not shy about being in solidarity with the people that you're covering. Right. I think should be a way to go. So, is there any other last word that you'd like to say to my audience, the Storybrooks audience?
Oh, I'm just so appreciative of everything that Storybrooke does, and it's such a pleasure. I come back to Pittsburgh for the holidays to visit my family, but I think it's just so great to see how the Pittsburgh media scene is trying to meet this moment. It's tough, I think, for any city to really be able to represent community stories, and I just really wanted to applaud all the ways you've made space for that. So thank you.
Right,
Thank you for having me.
All right. And enjoy the holidays.
You too.